Good morning. Finishing up a series where we've been looking through the book of 2 Timothy, Paul's second letter to Timothy. At the end of this letter and at the end of Paul's life, he's able to look back on his life and ministry and write. In the fourth chapter, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, and I have kept the faith. Paul is imprisoned when he's writing these words, and he knows that he will die soon. He writes this letter to give Timothy some instructions, to ask him to keep being a steward of the message that God had given to Timothy, asks him to both guard it and give it to others. He also urges Timothy to come quickly to Rome to see him. He knows he doesn't have much time left, asks him to bring some specific items, but really wants just to see Timothy. And he finishes his letter, and look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 14 through 22. It's written in your worship folder. There's a sheet if you'd like to follow along. Let me read. Paul writes, Alexander, the metal worker, did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. You too should be on your guard against him, because he strongly opposed our message. At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus stayed in Corinth. I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus greets you. So do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. Paul says that Alexander the metalworker did him a great deal of harm. In the first letter, he talks about Alexander. This was evidently somebody who was part of the Christian fellowship and then who ended up pulling out and causing a lot of discord, attacked Paul, might even have been responsible for Paul's imprisonment, did him a great deal of harm. And in terms of why that might have happened, perhaps it was an economic motive that caused him to turn against Paul. In Ephesus, there was Demetrius. He was a silver worker. Alexander, he worked with copper. Demetrius worked with silver. Either way, you did a brisk business with idols, constructing idols. And what it says in Acts 19, about that time there arose a great disturbance about the way, which was the way they referred to Christianity. He said, a silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen. He ends up opposing Paul. But the real issue is that with Paul's focus on the God of Israel, Isaac and Jacob, whom you weren't to make into the form of an image, that was bad for the metal business. We don't know exactly why, but anyways, what ended up happening is Paul was put in prison. And it says, at my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. The way Roman law worked, similar to ours, that they had a preliminary public hearing. And that was the first defense. And at this public hearing, the person who is being tried has an opportunity to give what's called an apology, which isn't an apology, I'm sorry. It is a defense of what they did, and if they bring a message, a defense of the message. And that's what Paul does. So he took opportunity then before the court to proclaim, this is why I speak, this is what happened to me. And at this defense, he said, no one was with him. Either no friends came forward to encourage him, or no one formally testified on his behalf. He felt very much alone. He says, may not be held against them. These individuals who didn't join him, it might have been a Peter thing, when Peter didn't want to ally himself with Jesus because of what would happen. they might not have been there. They might not have had anything beneficial to say. We don't know. But what Paul ends up saying, it's okay. It's okay. I don't have anything against them. But he was alone. He was alone. Well, that's not really so. Not everyone deserted him. What we read, when he was in Jerusalem, this was when the beginning of his problems with the law occurred. Paul writes, when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Jesus showed up. Said, quick, he said to me, leave Jerusalem immediately, because they will not accept your testimony about me. He had a vision. Then he ended up going to Jerusalem. They tried to tear him apart because he said that Jesus told them to go to the Gentiles. At any rate, they whisked him into the fortress, and the night after they did so, Paul writes, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so also you must testify about Rome. So to say that he was all alone isn't exactly correct, is it? Jesus showed up by his side in a vision and then an appearance and said, take courage. This is what I'm going to ask you to do. And Paul drew a lot of strength from those things. However, he was still alone. And Alexander posed a serious threat. And Paul was concerned. He still felt very much alone. Only Luke was with him. He knows that he will be martyred soon. I want you to picture this image. Paul's in prison. And he's waiting for the second trial, which will be the one that will indict him and cause him to die. Put a caption under this image. You got Paul? Doesn't have his cloak, doesn't have his Bible with him, doesn't have the reading material that he'd like. He asked Timothy to bring it. God causes all things to work together for good. Can you see Paul? God causes all things to work together for good. And it says in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. There's not many aspects of Paul's situation that are good. I think you'd agree with me. We talked about it last week. Good is a relative term. We know what good would mean for the coach of the Packers. That they would have been good if they had beaten the Vikings. And it was good that Sam Bradford was traded to the Vikings. And, okay. Good is a relative term. Donald Trump's version of good, Hillary Clinton's version of good are very different. In all things, God works for the good. Doesn't seem to fit with Paul's situation. What does good mean to God? What does good mean when God uses the word? There's a couple places in Scripture. Good consequences. Joseph ends up saying, you intended to harm me when he was confronted by his brothers at the end. They had come and he had them go, and finally he reveals himself to them, and he causes them to remember them throwing him in a pit. Not a good thing. That's what he says to them. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So what does good mean to God? And here it says good means the saving of many lives. Joseph was mistreated, left for dead, unjustly imprisoned. He lives to see his family provided for, and Egyptians as well. And what he's able to see, when the temporary suffering of one causes the welfare of many, God calls that good, as we say. That's why God calls that Friday Good Friday. The temporary suffering of one leads to the welfare of many. God calls that good. You can make a case for this from Paul's life. We saw that God causes all situations for good. When Paul was about to take his second missionary journey, in the first one, somebody named John Mark was supposed to go along with him. In fact, did go along with he and Barnabas. But when they arrived at their first place, John Mark ended up taking off and going back to Jerusalem. They finished that first journey. They went back to Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas had a discussion. They said, let's go back and let's visit all the places that we went to in our first journey. And Barnabas said, I think we should take John Mark. And Paul says, no, we shouldn't. He bailed on this first time. Barnabas said, no, Paul, I think that we really should take him. He was related to John Mark. And Paul said, no. And Barnabas said, yes and no. And it really became a very heated fight. In fact, they parted company. That's not a good thing. God causes all things for good. You know what ended up happening? So Barnabas ended up taking John Mark and going with him to Cyprus, and John Mark became, as we talked last week, the Mark who wrote the gospel. Barnabas took John Mark under his wing, developed him so he became a devoted Christian worker, ended up dying a martyr's death. And what's the difference between that first missionary journey where he bailed and the one where he ends up being a martyr? Is somebody taking John Mark under his wing. Barnabas did that. So that worked out. That worked for good. And Paul ended up taking Silas. He went to Ephesus, and there was a young believer there whom he saw something special in, heard about his family, and that individual's name was Timothy. And he ended up being the one Paul was able to leave in charge. So there was a fight, and yet God caused that fight to work together for good. Good meaning the saving of many lives. More people were influenced with the gospel because of what happened. Good means the saving of many lives. What else does good mean when God uses the word? Good means sharing in his holiness as well. Look what it says in Hebrews 12, 10 to 11. God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Then it goes on to say, but afterwards it leads to the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Discipline is about child rearing. Again, we talk God disciplines us for our good. Some of us, our experience with discipline, we think immediately of punishment, but that's not the Greek word. There's different words for punish, and there's another word for discipline. The word for discipline literally means to be with a child. And the focus, as we've talked about before, but bears repeating, the focus between discipline and punishment are very different. The focus and the motive are very different. The focus of punishment is on past incorrect behavior. The focus of discipline is on future correct behavior. When you discipline appropriately, you're thinking about what the child will do when he learns the right thing to do. The motive of punishment is wrath or anger. The motive of discipline is love. It says God disciplines us. Now, this experience of discipline is not pleasant, but painful. You're not going to like it. You're going to be in situations that you'd rather not be in. You'll be experiencing social things that you don't want to experience. You will be experiencing intellectual things that you won't want to experience. Physical things that you wouldn't want to experience. If you had your choice, you would not stay in that place. And what it says, God is treating us as children, putting us in places that we need to learn to remain, because in so doing, we will learn to share in his holiness. That tells me learning to share in Jesus' holiness is a matter of staying in places that would rather not stay. Painful places, hard circumstances with good consequences. Holiness here, it says, God disciplines us for our good that we may share in his holiness. When you think of holiness, what do you think about? You might think of somebody who leads the pack in terms of moral behavior. They lead the way in terms of what they do for God, and that is one definition of holiness. But in this place, holiness is, as it's described, as the passage goes on, is not evidenced out in front of people. It's not, the holy people are not leading, but in fact, it's just the opposite. The people who are holy aren't looking to charge ahead. Their eyes are on who is behind, strengthening feeble knees. And holiness in this context is looking for those who have fallen by the wayside. Holiness is not evidenced out here if it's evidenced back here, coming alongside those who are falling by the wayside, helping them up. How can I help? Assisting them so that they can keep walking the path that's truly best. Hard circumstances lead to good consequences. The ability to humbly come alongside individuals whom we can support and help to walk on the path. That's good consequences. And what the Bible seems to indicate that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him and were called according to His purpose. All things, biblically, seems to be talking about hard circumstances. Now, all things work for good, but when it talks about the things that God uses, the hard circumstances, we're going to talk about three of them. Swords, goads, and thorns. Sword, thorn, goad. These three things seem to be some of the things that God uses to bring good circumstances, good consequences. Let's talk about sword. In Matthew 10, Jesus is talking to His disciples, and this is what He says. I did not come to bring peace, as He's talking about them. I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. What Jesus tells His disciples is that He's come to bring a sword into their lives. And for them, this is not for everyone, but for those specifically tasked with carrying the message, what Jesus tells them, don't imagine that this is going to mean a nice life. Now, there will be things, and Jesus did walk and does walk, but what He tells them, it's not going to make for a nice family life for you. When James and John are with their father in the fishing business, and Jesus comes to them and says, come follow me. And when James and John turn around and abandon their father, it doesn't make him feel real good. He doesn't go, oh, have a wonderful life. No, I'll be fine. I'll be fine with the fishing business. I'll take care of it. I'm good. He's, wait. How am I going to do this? And they turn around and they follow Jesus, and it means that their family experienced some things that were difficult. A lot of times what Jesus is saying, and sometimes happen, vertical connection can lead to horizontal disconnection. In fact, not can, but with Jesus and the disciples, He doesn't say might, He said will. They will experience conflict within their families. For the heck of it, I want you to think of people in the Bible that have been used by God. Think of them. Names, not faces. Think about them. Moses, David, Jesus, Paul. Question. How many of them had nice family lives? David? This was the case with Jesus, and again, it just seems to be one of those difficult realities. Jesus went up on a mountainside, it reads in Mark 3, called to Him those He wanted, and they came to Him. He appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with Him and that He might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. And then it says, then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that He and His disciples were not even able to eat. When His family heard about this, they went to take charge of Him, for they said, we're so proud of our boy. He's picking 12, and he's not even taking time to eat. He doesn't visit us much anymore either. He walked away from us a while ago, but we really are so proud of him. You know what they said? They went to take charge of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. Our boy is crazy. In all things, even socially challenging circumstances. Even socially challenging circumstances. Taking sword to family ties, God causes all things to work together for good. All things. All things. Hard circumstances. Good consequences. Talk about, that's a sword. Talk about the goad. In Acts 26, 14 through 16, Paul writes, I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. Then I asked, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now, get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen of me and what I will show you. It said it's hard for you to kick against the goads. A goad is a prod. It's a means to control animals. So it has a point on it. What you use a goad for, it has a sharp point, and you stick an animal to make him go in the direction you want him to go. To kick against the goads, then, is to have somebody jabbing you and then to kick against it. You know, somebody's poking you to go this way, and you stop it. Nobody likes to be poked. And what Jesus ends up, he asks Paul a question that answers it. Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you going to Damascus to beat up Christians? And then he answers his question. Because it's hard for you to kick against the goads. And what Jesus understood is that Paul was resisting something, and that's why he was going to Damascus. It's common to interpret God as the one goading. That God is kind of poking Paul. You know, my son is God. So you better believe. I don't think that's what it's about. It appeals to us in a way. You know, that would God goad anyone? Does he poke and prod and fog us, push us, drive us to believe in him? What is Jesus saying when it's hard for you to kick against the goads? Well, we know that the goad is a weapon of a conquered people. If you were conquered, for instance, Israelites were conquered by the Philistines. What the Philistines did is they put a certain category of worker out of business. That would be weapon makers. So they took weapon makers out of the equation and weapons out of the hands of the Israelites. And so if you were looking for a weapon to be able to mount some type of defense, you know what you would do? You would get goads. A goad could be used, and you would use goads and get them pointed, and it was a rough weapon. At least you could do some damage to it. It says in the Bible, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrew will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and for repointing goads. A goad is a weapon of a resistance movement. You know what I think what it's talking about when it says it's hard for you to kick against the goads? As a Jewish leader, Paul would have been prodded to join the Jewish resistance movement. He was a Pharisee. A Pharisee was a leader. It was like a politician. And I think fellow Pharisees are pointing out, you know, Paul, what's up? You know, we need to get Rome off our back, and you should be the one leading the movement. The problem was, Paul wasn't just a Jewish citizen, he was a Roman citizen too. And so he had a difficult time resisting this Jewish. In fact, I think what he understood is that it wasn't God's purpose for Rome to be defeated at the hands of Israel. And this created problems for Paul because he was pulled inside. Sometimes we think this and we think that. And it creates difficulties for us because we don't feel, I don't think Paul felt lined up. On the one hand, he sympathized with Jewish causes. On the other hand, he sympathized with Roman causes. And he couldn't give himself to either one. You know what Paul's issue was? He was pulled apart inside. And in fact, I think that's why he went to kill Christians, because Romans didn't like Christians, and Jews didn't like Christians. So if you wanted to kind of curry the favor of both Romans and Jews, try to bring your inward life together, what do? Beat up Christians. Then the Jews would like you and the Romans would like you, and then so what Jesus said, hey, Paul, why are you persecuting me? I'll tell you why you're persecuting me. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. You're goaded by Rome, and you're goaded by Jews. And I think what Jesus ends up kind of indicating, see, I think what Paul thought is that God was telling him to do those things. God was goading him. And no, God didn't goad him. It's not how God works. He doesn't prod us from behind. He leads us from in front. You know what goading is? Again, when you relate to an animal that's being poked, I think goading is fog-based spiritual influence. Fog. Fear, obligation, and guilt. Fear, obligation, and guilt. You should be doing this. You should be doing that. Using fear as a prod. Using obligation as a prod. Using guilt as a prod. I think goading is fog-based spiritual influence. The problem is, those who speak for God might use fog, but God doesn't. I don't think God goads. I don't think he prods. He calls. See, for God, it's not what you do, but why you do it. If you do the right thing for the wrong reason, it doesn't make points with him. It's not what you do, but why you do it. It has to be driven by love. And fear and love cannot be coincidental. It's either one's up and the other's down. Either your fear is high and love is low, or love is high and fear is low. But it really is like a seesaw. In terms, I remember once, I bet I was third or fourth grade. And Paul Fury lived next door. I went to church a bunch. And he says, gee, Mike, why in the heck do you go to church so much? And I ended up saying something to the effect, because I love God and I'm afraid of going to hell. And I was saying both. And what I found biblically is it's one or the other. It's either fear is driving an obligation and guilt, or it's love. We goad when we use fog to influence people to obey God. When we use fear, obligation, and guilt to get people to obey, we are goading individuals. Would you agree there's a difference between in God we trust and in goad we trust? Which is it? Do you trust in God, or do you trust in goad? What is it for those you're trying to influence? In all things, even culturally challenging internal conflicts, God causes all things to work together for good. There's the sword, the goad, and the thorn. What it says in 2 Corinthians 12. To keep me from being conceited, Paul writes, because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We don't know what Paul's thorn was. You know what a thorn is? It's something that makes it hard to walk, but something, it's not so hard that you can't walk. It's not like a broken leg. If it's a broken leg, you can't keep going. If it's a thorn, it's kind of irritating. You know, like when you get a rock in your shoe. You know, you can keep walking, but it's uncomfortable. You have to take your sandal off and get the rock out of your shoe. Same thing with a thorn. You can keep going, but it's a little bit difficult. That's what a A thorn was painful but not debilitating. Paul couldn't take time off. He just had to do what he did with an added element of burden and pain. What ends up happening, though, whatever it is, we think it might have been an eye problem. It just, geez, I don't want to look at him. You see it, he had all this matter coming out of his eye, and he just kind of, his eye's doing this thing, and it does this. I can't stand to look at him. And what Paul wants, he wants this thorn to go because people would listen to the message. And he tells Jesus, like, I'm trying to do the message here, but everybody's looking at me do this or whatever I'm doing. And if you just take this away, then the message would go forward and would be good. And remove it so that it stops being an obstacle. Jesus' words bring clarity. He ends up saying, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Weakness is the inability to use what you have to get what you want. It's not an obstacle. And what Jesus ends up saying to Paul, your inability to get over this thing, to be perfectly healthy, you think that's an impediment. What he ends up saying, that's probably one of the best things you have going for you. Because my power is made perfect in weakness. Divine ability and human inability are a perfect match. If you are able, proficient, sufficient, to that degree, your trust in God will be challenged and compromised. If you're in a place where you understand, I can't use what I have to get what I want, you understand weakness, that's a place where God's power can flow both to and through you. This is one thing to think about, but if you're ill, or if you have somebody you care about that's ill, it's one thing to think it. It's another thing to experience an illness, or to have somebody very close to you who's experiencing an illness. Interesting thing. Part of Paul's entourage, let me read from Acts 19. When Paul was in Ephesus, it says, God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them. So here's what's happening. Paul's going through Ephesus, and people are just touching him with handkerchiefs, taking this handkerchief to the bed of somebody who's sick, touching the handkerchief to them, and they're getting well. So everybody's picking up, they're bringing the handkerchiefs, and they're coming to Paul, and he's getting besieged with handkerchiefs. And what ends up saying, Paul was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus, from Berea, Aristarchus, and Secundus, Gaius, and you say, Mike, Timothy, Tychicus, and Trophimus from the province of Asia. Timothy was there. Tychicus and Trophimus. Timothy was, in Paul's estimation, the most faithful of his co-workers. He was like a son. Here's what Paul writes to him. Stop drinking water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Wait a minute. Didn't he just, he was in Ephesus, and all they had to do was take a handkerchief and just touch Paul, and then he would go and people were healed. What is Timothy doing with stomach problems? Why doesn't Paul just wave a hand over him? It's interesting. In 2 Corinthians 4, in the last part, it says, I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. You see that at the end of that passage? It's in the passage that we read. Where's Trophimus? I had to leave him sick in my... Wait, time, Paul, wait a minute. You remember when Trophimus, Timothy, and Aristarchus, remember when they went with you? And you remember what happened? You did all the miracle things, and the handkerchiefs, and why don't you heal Trophimus? Why did you leave Trophimus sick in Miletus? Why don't you just take away Timothy's stomach problems and illnesses? Why? Can we agree? It is not God's will that people are always healed? Can we agree with that? That certainly is the case, isn't it? Certainly is the case. If it was God's will that these individuals will be healed, it's not that Trophimus did anything wrong. It's not that he had a lack of faith. He went with him. He was a part of his entourage. It's not that Timothy did anything wrong. Sometimes you hear that. The reason why you're not healed is you lack faith. That wasn't Timothy's problem. It wasn't Trophimus's problem either. The deal was God doesn't heal all of his children. And that's true of those with physical issues and emotional issues. He doesn't heal his kids all the time. Why wouldn't he? You know why? Because hard circumstances lead to good consequences. Sometimes we have to learn to live in places that we don't want to live, and we end up holding on to the reality of our pain and holding on to the reality of our hope at the same time. You understand that, though, don't you? Some of you understand what it's like to have to hold on to something that feels like a sword, family turbulence, or you have to hold on to cultural things. You feel pulled inside by different values, different things, or you have to hold a physical issue. So you have to hold a physical issue, a cultural issue, a social issue, and you wonder where God is. And what God seems to happen here, in all things, God works for the good. All things. Swords, thorns, and goads. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. There's a quote there by C.S. Lewis that I like because it ends up saying some things pretty directly. I'm going to just read that and then I'll close us. It's on the back. There's a timeline of Paul. We won't include this again, but I wanted you to have a timeline of him. C.S. Lewis writes, I dare not leave out the hard saying which I once heard from an experienced Christian. I have seen many striking answers to prayer, and more than one that I thought miraculous. But they usually come at the beginning, before conversion, or soon after it. As the Christian life proceeds, they tend to be rarer. The refusals, too, are not only more frequent, they become more unmistakable, more emphatic. Lewis writes, if our prayers are sometimes granted beyond all hope and probability, we had better not draw hasty conclusions to our own advantage. If we were stronger, we might be less tenderly treated. If we were braver, we might be sent with far less help to defend far more desperate posts in the great battle. Again, pray for things, absolutely pray. But if you are holding difficulties, sword, thorn, and goad, don't assume that something is wrong. There's nothing wrong with Paul. There was nothing wrong with Timothy. There was nothing wrong with Trophimus. But they had issues. Here's my encouragement for you. And we're going to, worship team, come on up. We'll sing a final song. Two things you got to do. And it requires two hands. Hang on to the hurt and hang on to the hope. Sometimes we let go of the hurt and pretend that everything's fine. Don't do that. It leads to hypocrisy. Hang on to the hurt. Sometimes we hang on to the hurt and don't hang on to the hope, and we become morbid, and there's no hope for me. There is hope for you. And what we can do then, hang on to the reality of the hurt, hang on to the reality of the hope. How can you do that? Remember, in all things, in all things, things that don't feel good, places that you'd rather not sit, things you'd rather not deal with, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, to bring about the sharing in his holiness and the saving of many lives. Father, thank you for hope. That in all things, you work for the good of those who love you and are called according to your purpose. And the all things mean things that don't feel good, they feel hard. Even in the midst of hard things, you bring about good purposes. Hard circumstances bring about good consequences. Thank you that you're able to do that, and you do in fact do that. In Jesus' name, amen.